Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think this is a much awaited webinar today on home working. I know some of the issues that people are specifically interested in are about contracts of employment and how they interface with the fact that we've got people working from home now. And also, you know, costs and expenses, they seem to be, you know, quite a big question around, you know, do we have to pay for things? Are there tax benefits? You know, how do we deal with the fact that we've got people working at home now? So I'm going to address some of those points as we go through. So firstly, it's important to note that the term home worker, which is probably what we'd all call ourselves at the moment, is not actually defined legally. So there's no reference in the Employment Rights Act 1996 to what is actually a home worker. So they could be called home workers, agile workers, off-site workers, teleworkers, telecommuters. There are all sorts of terms that have been used. And of course, it could be a mix of people who are working exclusively from home. And at the moment, so for example, I'm working exclusively from home, or they could be doing some part-time work from home with some work in the office, or going between different premises and also doing some occasional work from home. So there's lots of different ways in which people may be using their home to actually do work. I think before the pandemic, probably all of us that were able to do so, especially if I had a big case on or something like that, I would be saying, right, I'm going to have a day working from home because I can get my head down, no interruptions, which is very different, of course, to the arrangements that we've got in place now with people almost sometimes permanently working from home. They could, of course, be mobile workers. So you could have some people who use their home as an administrative base. So, for example, salespeople who are on the road. Very often it's the case that they can be people that, say, are to be designated with their home as their work base for administrative purposes. Or you could have people that are working in specially designed telecottages, as they're called, although I don't think that probably applies to anybody that's on the webinar today. So just some statistics, because I really like statistics. The Office of National Statistics says that 73% of home workers are the highest skilled roles in the economy. And I guess that would kind of make sense on the basis that if you're in manufacturing, if you're on a production line, for example, you can't do that from home. Whereas if you're doing more office-based work, that can probably be done from home. So they still say that the proportion of workers in the UK who work entirely from home is still relatively low. But I think with COVID-19, we're going to see a change in people's attitudes generally towards working remotely from home more. And that's mainly because of the developments we've had in technology and the fact that it's easier for us all to work from home now. If this had probably happened maybe 10, even 15 years ago, there'd be much more fallout, much more impact on business, because we wouldn't have been able to set up at home as quickly as we have been able to, having all the broadband in place, and almost as if to just start working from your home office or your kitchen table, wherever it is you're working, rather than actually being in the office itself. So from that point of view, you know, from a timing point of view, actually, we were all ready to go, or at least nearly there. So as we know, home working has benefits, but also drawbacks for both employers and employees. Those employers that are entering into home working arrangements obviously will need to deal with a number of practical issues, which may include, and I've touched on this earlier, tailoring standard employment contracts to encompass home working, taking appropriate measures to protect confidential information and personal data, reviewing health and safety. And certainly in advance of today's webinar, I've had a question which is actually around health and safety. And of course, what flows from that is, of course, risk assessments. Deciding whether any special equipment should be provided, consider whether there are any special planning or insurance arrangements that need to be considered, deciding what arrangements should be made for the management and supervision of individuals. I know I've been contacted even this morning by a client who needs to update their internet and communications policy, and also the monitoring provision in their contract, because it was a bit too vague and needed to be more specific, because they've introduced a new system and software now that allows them to be able to monitor exactly what somebody is doing. So they could effectively log onto the computer, see how many emails they're sending, see what they're typing, see what they're saying effectively. Because they've had a number of employees who have become vacant during hours of the day, and they can't actually assess what they've been doing. So there'll be changes like that. Identifying the tax consequences of home working. And ACAS have produced a guidance which you can access to have a look at, which should assist you with your background reading around home working generally. So whilst home working is regarded by some as a perk for employees, employers should also be aware of the substantial benefits there are from home working. And I think all of us would have to accept that, you know, without home working, our businesses probably would have come to a halt the minute that Boris decided that we couldn't go to work anymore. But what are some of the benefits for companies? Obviously, there's reduced overhead costs. So the need for expensive office space and other office overheads can sometimes be reduced. And those costs can be relocated, of course, to other parts of the business to put in place, you know, things like software and other support systems for people to be able to work from home. There's increased productivity. Obviously, many of us are being spared travel time and the associated stresses of trying to get into Worcester, for example. And there's a lot of evidence that time gained around those times leads to much more productive output. Better motivation. Lots of workers respond well to being able to work from home, mainly because it's easier for them to arrange their days in terms of accommodating personal obligations as well. But that's it, that, you know, with many, there's a culture of, well, I have to make sure I'm going over and above because I don't want to be picked out as one of those people that's not been doing the work they should have been doing. And actually, as a result, the company gets greater productivity. Skills retention. Workers who might otherwise be lost because of family relocation or family responsibilities or temporary or permanent disabilities may stay with your organisation if you're prepared to allow for temporary or permanent home working. Team flexibility. Geography and travel time are less of an impediment and team workers can be assembled more easily, especially we've seen things like Zoom, Teams coming to the fore, and all the meetings that we will normally have had face-to-face are now all, you know, very easily being dealt with remotely. Organisations geared to home working may be able to better withstand business interruptions, and in that respect I'm talking about transport problems, adverse weather conditions, even terrorist threats. So there's lots of reasons as to why that would work generally, even outside of COVID. There are, however, reasons why some organisations may be reluctant to embrace home working. And I just gave you that example of a client this morning who was somebody that is experiencing some difficulties because they've got people that seem to be absent throughout the day. One of those then that flows from that is the loss of control that you would have over staff and what they're doing during those hours. A really important one, I think, is damage to team working and culture. It's okay throwing everything up in the air and saying, right, this has really worked, so what we're going to do is shut all of our offices, we don't need an office space anymore, and we'll just meet on Teams, and we'll idea share every time we do that. I'm sure that might work to a certain extent, but I think we'd all probably agree that from a culture point of view and from a team working point of view, there's nothing better than face-to-face sitting around a table and sharing those ideas and agreeing how you're going to go forward. Different management styles may be required to oversee home workers, and it may be difficult for managers who are used to managing face-to-face to now undertake that management to the same degree if people are working from home. The business may become overly dependent on technology, and there could be extra costs associated with that, or duplication of costs in relation to equipment. The employer will be reliant to a large degree on trust and may fear that some employees are not pulling their weight. That could lead to disciplinary issues and a lot of management time associated with that. One of the real issues, I think, is potential data security breaches. You know, we're all at home, we've all got lots of information at home, which is confidential, and there's the possibility of that data being breached in terms of security. Requests are often made for home working by employees, I think, from workers who believe they'll find it easier to manage their personal commitments if they're actually working from home. But what appears as an advantage may not always prove to be the case in practice. So some workers might find it more difficult to keep work and home life separate, not always knowing when to stop. And I can tell you now, if I'm in touch with the team at 7 o'clock at night, I'm getting emails back at 7 o'clock at night. You know, they're not switching off at 5 o'clock. And they're not sending messages from their phones either. It's definitely from their computers. So that shows that people are working at different hours, and certainly later into the evenings and possibly earlier in the mornings. Another potential drawback is that home workers may feel lonely. and bored. They may not have motivation. They could feel alienated from the organisation because they're not in contact with people. And they may miss their workplace facilities. I think a couple of the team have said that the coffee at their homes is better than the coffee that was in the office. So I can't always say that's the case. But they may well be missing that team and having everything to hand, you know, even if it's stationery, it's staplers, all of that sort of stuff. They may be missing all of that familiarity, and that can have effect on, obviously, on people's mental health. So looking at practical considerations, you'll need to address the number of practicalities when entering into the home working arrangement, and some of the provisions of the contract of employment will need to be tailored to fit the specific needs of home working. So some of the issues that may be relevant: place of work. So the contract will specify where the employee's principal place of work is, because that's a Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act requirement for it to be in their terms and conditions. And ordinarily, I would have said up to March, the contracts that you would have issued, if they're not for employees that are home workers or based administratively from home, it would say that your place of work is, and it'll be the office address. But if you're going to deal with the place of work, you've also got to deal with the fact that you might want to change that. So there's no point, you know, changing the contract just to say your place of work will now be your home, because the contract will also need to reserve the right for you to attend at the office from time to time, whether that's for team meetings or appraisals or even for disciplinary issues. So even if you're going to adjust the contract to now deal with the place of work temporarily or permanently, depending on what arrangements you're agreeing with your staff, then the contract should still reserve the right for you to require employees to come into the business premises. Secondly, there's hours of work. So obviously it's crucial to establish the boundaries of working time, and in particular when it's deemed the home worker will be available. So are you going to be completely flexible with the employee? Can they choose the hours that they're going to work? Are you requiring them to observe their strict office hours, say for example 9 till 5? Or will there be a core time when they must be available? Are you going to require the employee to work outside of their normal hours? In which case you need to give consideration to the working time regulations and of course maximum weekly hours and minimum rest breaks. One of the problems you'll have is that because no one is actually going to be overseeing the workers to make sure that they're taking their breaks, you'll need to adjust and deal with the working time regulations in that respect. So very often you will see in senior managers' contracts, people like directors and the more senior people in your organisation, what's called a Regulation 20 carve out, which says under the working time regulations, you're working at a particular level that you are effectively responsible for managing your own time, which means that you are responsible for taking breaks as appropriate. Normally, I would say in your contracts of employment, it will say you're entitled to and 1 hour for lunch. That must be taken between 12 and 3 and a 15-minute break in the morning and the afternoon. Now, on the basis that the employee is taking those breaks, that's fine. If they're working from home, you can't manage that. So you may need to think about having a look at the drafting of the clause that deals with working time regulations to make sure that employees are responsible for managing their own time in that respect, and therefore not creating a liability for you if they're not taking their breaks. Salary and benefits. You need to make sure that the salary and benefits packages that you're offering to people who are working from home is no less favourable than those employees that are working in the workplace. If they're treated less favourably, then they could have a claim under discrimination legislation. When you're considering benefits which arise from employment, such as subsidised staff restaurants, you should ensure that home workers are not prevented from accessing those benefits or facilities wherever that is possible. For example, you're probably not expected to compensate for on-site facilities such as a gym or a workplace nursery, provided that the home worker has access to them, even if they're never taken up. If it appears that a home worker will not be able to take advantage of some or all of their benefits because of their workplace, then you should consider whether they should be compensated or provided with alternative arrangements. Expenses. The contract will need to specify which expenses the employee can claim, whether that's travelling expenses to attend the office if it's been the case that their home has become their permanent workplace, telephone costs, heating and lighting costs, and any increased insurance premiums. The European Social Partners issued a voluntary framework agreement on teleworking in 2002. That suggested that if homework is performed on a regular basis, then the employer should cover all direct costs, particularly those related to communications. Now, it's important to point out that this is very old legislation, and it's also voluntary, which means it's non-binding in the UK. Whether we see further legislation, I think is something that probably will be brought to the attention of government, and it is something that government will look at. I don't know if any of you noticed, but probably about 6 to 8 weeks ago, Spain announced that they would be putting in provisions to make sure that all those people working from home would be entitled to certain expenses for their home working, and that's been done as obviously from a government-led point of view. At present, though, no obligation in that respect. Holidays. Home workers obviously should have the same amount of holidays comparable office-based workers, and they'll be entitled to their normal 5.6 weeks paid leave if they're a full-time worker. What you'll need to clarify is if you've got people working from home, they've still got to comply with the appropriate processes to be able to request holiday and gain approval. Illness. The employee who works at home will have the same entitlement to sick pay as any other employee, but again, you need to reinforce what the mechanisms are for reporting illness and any other adjustments that may need to be made to the process. Confidentiality. All employees, as we know, have an implied duty, it's implied by law to give the contract business efficacy, that they should not disclose confidential information or use it for any purpose other than the employer's business. In practice, however, confidentiality is more difficult for you to police when the employee is actually working from home. So whilst the implied duty of confidentiality applies equally to home workers, most employers will also want to include an express confidentiality clause in a home worker's contract, which clearly defines what information is deemed to be confidential. So you may already have a confidential information clause in the contract that may not specifically set out what the information is that the employee may have at home. So you may want to think about expanding what that definition is, that it covers any of the information that the employee physically may have at home or may have access to. Obviously, the home worker's got to keep confidential information secure, and you may want to consider precautions for keeping that information secure, such as forbidding access by household members to any computers, looking at passwords and encryption, any secure filing cabinets if that's necessary, and any other facilities for confidential information disposal, such as shredders and confidential bins. Equipment. The use and monitoring of communications, that's something I've touched on, isn't it, this morning? You'll need to consider what equipment will be required by a home worker, who will provide and pay for it, and who can have access to it. So, for example, we have rolled out packs to our home workers, which has a laptop stand-in, a wireless keyboard and a wireless mouse, mainly from health and safety point of view, but also from a comfort home working point of view, just to make it easier for staff to be able to work. If a home worker is going to be using computer equipment supplied by the company and will have access to the internet or email facilities, the employer will need to consider the application of any systems it has in place for policing that use. So look at your IT and communications policy and look at your monitoring policies, which is what I was talking about with that client this morning, and see what you need to put in place to make sure you can police use. You'll also need to satisfy yourself that the risk of a data security breach is low, possibly by way of a data privacy impact assessment. So that's something that you may need to implement. You can address the following issues by the introduction of an IT and communications policy if you've not already got one in place. Measures to protect confidentiality of electronic information, the use of email and the internet and the extent to which, if at all possible, they can use it for personal reasons, the employee's monitoring of the use of electronic communications and what will be considered inappropriate use. So if you haven't got a policy in place that covers those things, then you need to put one in place now. And also you may need to think about reviewing it if it doesn't cover the circumstances that you now have with home workers. It should give clear information about the types of monitoring that you may undertake. So with that client example that I gave you this morning, that policy will specifically inform employees that they can remote into their system and watch exactly what they're doing on a minute-by-minute basis if they needed to do so. Who will have access to be able to do that from the company, and access to the employer's computer by others in the household. You need to address that specifically because I think that's an area where there is a potential for real data breaches. You also need to consider whether the policy captures issues that typically affect home workers. For example, does it provide guidance to the employee on appropriate use of social media, the employee's obligations to protect the employer's reputation, even from home, and the tension between being a brand ambassador for an employer's brands and the employee disparaging the brand on social media in their own time. For example, blurring the distinction between work time and home time. We've had a situation before where we've had a client where the employee had taken pictures working from home of the desk space where they were using and posted them on social media. By doing that, you could see information concerning clients in the background on those pictures, and as a result, that individual was dismissed for gross misconduct because there was a significant breach of data protection. So one, because they weren't thinking straight. Everybody thinks that it's okay to post funny pictures of you working at home on social media, but as a result, it identified confidential information in the background, which led to their dismissal. Discipline and grievances. Obviously, the employer's normal disciplinary and grievance procedures would apply to a home worker in the same way as employees. You may want to use disciplinary grievance rules to prohibit home workers from using work time for domestic, family or other commitments such as household chores, running other businesses or childcare. Alternatively, you could consider whether to implement specific rules setting out expectations from home workers. And in fact, that might be a good opportunity for you to lay down a set of rules for the people that do work from home. In that, you can address a number of issues which may relate to the general way that people work. But with respect to the contract and those terms that I highlighted, really you'd be looking at issuing an addendum to deal with those contract changes. Something else that won't be in the contract of employment that you need to think about is potentially the right to enter. So you'll need to reserve the right to enter the employee's home, for example, to install, maintain or service the company's equipment, to recover the property if there's a termination of employment, and to carry out a risk assessment for health and safety purposes. There's a question that we've had, as I said, in advance, which I will deal with, which is to do with health and safety in the workplace, and I'll touch on that point that I've just covered when I deal with that question. Trial periods. You'll need to consider whether you wish to include a provision which enables home working arrangements to be brought to an end. If the employer has concerns as to how the arrangement will work, it's sensible to have an initial trial period and a right to require the employee to revert to conventional working at the end of that period. If there's to be a trial period, you need to confirm the duration and the measures that will be used to identify success or failure of the trial period. And again, that needs to be clearly set out in the contract or any addendum that you provide. So the offer of a trial period can assist in the defence of a discrimination claim. In Southall versus London Chamber of Commerce, sorry to refer to a Chamber of Commerce in this particular case, a tribunal accepted that a trial period was reasonable. The employee had requested a change of hours following maternity leave, but refused to undergo a trial period. Her refusal helped justify the employer's rejection of her request. The employee argued that the imposition of a trial period was indirect sex discrimination. The tribunal found the trial period would have been justified in the circumstances and was not related to sex. So there's no problem in you introducing a trial period from that point of view. In practice, an employee is usually going to agree to a trial period without difficulty. The employer's obligation to make a decision on the request would in effect be suspended until the end of the trial period. But it's important, therefore, that you keep abreast of when the trial period is and what you need then to bring that trial period to an end, whether it's going to be confirming success or failure. If a request for home working is made by way of a formal flexible working request, then an employer needs to be aware that the flexible working legislation needs to be complied with. If the employer agrees to a trial period, this will postpone your decision in relation to a final outcome on the flexible working decision. But as I've stated, you must make sure that you comply with the appropriate legislation, especially if you've got a number of requests. Obviously, if you've had a trial period, you need to reserve the right to revert to the normal working requirements, even if it's been a lengthy trial period. The problem with that is that the lengthier the trial period, the more difficult it is to revert to the previous home working, especially if it's been successful. Once the parties have embarked on a home working arrangement, it may be difficult to force the employee to revert back from back to office working, as I've said, even if there's an express term. So even if you have reserved the right for somebody to revert back to working in the office when you've agreed a trial period, just be aware of the potential complications that may arise, whether it's a grievance or a claim, if you do subsequently require the employee to return to the office where the trial period has actually been successful. In particular, as well as a discrimination claim that could be pursued in that respect, you'd be looking to make sure that you did not behave in a way which would breach the implied term of trust and confidence, because that could lead to an employee resigning and claiming constructive dismissal. Termination needs to be considered as well. The contract needs to include normal provisions relating to the protection of confidential information and the return of company property on termination, in particular any software or confidential information that might be stored on the employee's computer or retained in their home. Dealing with and reporting on appraisals is another difficult thing to achieve whilst you've got home working. So obviously appraisals are used to reward performance and motivate workers by identifying training and development needs and setting objectives, and to set out what the employee's career aspirations are. Informal appraisals occur on an ongoing basis in the workplace where there's day-to-day contact, and feedback on work performed can be given on a daily basis too, but that might be difficult if you've got a situation where people are working from home. So you may need to think about your current appraisal policy and whether there's anything you need to do to adjust that to make it more fit for purpose for home working. Obviously, home workers need to be appraised just like any other employee, but home workers might be concerned that managers are worried about the fact that they've not been working as they should be, or the fact that they've not had face-to-face contact with them and therefore they cannot be assessed appropriately. So again, have a think about your system and think about how that might be adjusted to accommodate any concerns the home workers may have about that. Obviously, home workers cannot be denied promotional prospects, which those working in the office are open to, just because they're working from home. There may be good reasons why you're not promoting them, but make sure that it's not connected to the fact that they've been working from home and therefore have been perhaps less visible to those managers or employees that have been in the office. Data protection, which obviously is a really significant issue with home working. There are serious data protection implications arising from the GDPR and the DPA. You will need to take appropriate technical and organisational measures to prevent unauthorised or unlawful processing of data that identifies individuals, and against the accidental loss or destruction or damage of personal data. That arises even though you've got people that may be using that data or processing that data whilst they're working from home. So we know under that legislation that processing is widely defined to include obtaining, storing, viewing, holding, recording, transmitting, or destroying information or data, or carrying out the operation or set of operations on that information or data. So the GDPR and the DPA require that personal data is processed in accordance with a number of principles as set out in Article 5. We know that the definition of personal data is very broad, and it encompasses any data which alone or in conjunction with other data can be used to identify a living individual. So what about data protection and home working? Home workers may need specific training on their obligations and those of the employer in relation to data protection and confidentiality, concerning the procedures that they have to follow and what is not an authorised use of data. You should be carrying out a data privacy impact assessment of the data protection implications of employees working from home. The ICO has the power directly to impose significant fines on data controllers for serious breaches of GDPR, as we well know. The assessment could cover the following: who will have access to the employee's computer and personal data stored on it? Specific security measures should be in place to ensure that members of the household that the person is living with do not have access to the personal data held on the computer. The most practical route is for the employer to provide all the equipment, such as computer equipment, and to forbid access by other members of the household. But if you haven't got that in a policy at the moment, that might be something that you need to look at and put in place. Will the employee's home be left unattended for regular periods? And if so, is it going to be properly secured? Does the remote working system permit the employee to encrypt or password protect information? Is sharing of passwords clearly forbidden, for example? Do we address all of these things in the current policies that we have? Do you instruct your employees to change their passwords regularly and, of course, to never share them? Where paper files are kept, are there suitable systems for storage, such as secure filing cabinets? How is the information moved between the home and the office, both in terms of physical transfer by post or courier and data transfer electronically? If, for example, you've got people driving around, coming into the office, collecting papers, collecting files, and then driving home, you know, what do you deal with in terms of your policy concerning what the limits are that they can do when they have that information in their vehicles? So, for example, you know, have they been and collected it, but on the way back, they've realised if I just drop into Morrison's, I can get that loaf of bread and milk, and then I can find my way home, and I've been and picked up the work. Well, what happens if the car's broken into at the time that they're in Morrison's? So again, do your policies deal with those sorts of eventualities and the requirement for employees not to do a load of shopping and carry that confidential information around with them if they're doing personal errands, for example? Are employees given guidance about what data it is appropriate to transfer? Are there rules on retention of documents, proper disposal, such as shredding or paper-based records, and storage and deletion of computerised personal data? Is equipment provided to enable effective shredding of paper records? Have you thought about those things and what people are doing with the information that they're discarding when they're working from home? What measures will need to be taken against accidental loss, destruction or damage of property? And have staff been given training and guidance, and are regular reminders sent to staff about their obligations of safeguarding company information or personal data that they are processing? Obviously, giving online training like we are now is a good opportunity for you to make use of if you want to have conversations with your relevant teams about data protection and provide that training. It can all be done virtually. Health and safety. An employer is responsible for an employee's welfare, health and safety, so far as is reasonably practicable, whilst they're working at home. So you must conduct a suitable and sufficient risk assessment of all work activities carried out by employees, including your home workers, to identify hazards and assess the degree of risk. That's a requirement under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. You will need to consider these obligations in the context of any employee who works from home to decide what measures they need to be put in place. So what sort of issues are there? You'll need to address the following sort of health and safety issues in the context of home working. Firstly, one that sort of dovetails with, I think one of the webinars that are coming up is around mental health and well-being. And so stress is one of the things that you need to deal with in that assessment. Some home workers may have difficulty enforcing boundaries between work and home life, and that may lead to increased stress. They may become isolated, as we've talked about earlier. There may be a lack of support networks because of people isolating themselves or trying to do what they can to limit the spread of COVID, which means that they're having less contact with people generally, let alone people from work. You need to be aware of these issues, consider what steps you can put in place to monitor work and stress levels, and to integrate home workers into the team where possible. Equipment. The provision and use of Work Equipment Regulations 1998 cover the use of work equipment in the home. Equipment supplied by you must be suitable for its purpose, maintained in good working order, and inspected regularly. That's your obligation, not the employee's obligation. You also have to ensure that there's suitable and sufficient lighting that's provided at any place where the employee uses work equipment. This may involve simple steps to enhance the lighting in the room set aside for them doing their home working. Electricity at work. The use of electrical equipment at work is covered by a variety of EU and UK legislation. Briefly, you're responsible for the equipment that you supply. However, the home workers' domestic supply, including electrical sockets, remains their responsibility, and they will need to be reminded of this. So if they've got some fire hazard because they've got some old, I don't know, socket, or they're using 3 extension leads plugged in together to come across the room so that they can plug in their laptop and sit at the desk, that's clearly going to be a health and safety risk and something that you're going to have to address. First aid. As daft as it sounds, you must supply appropriate first aid provisions and supplies to all employees, including home workers. The precise requirements depend on the nature of the work involved, and obviously most home working will be low risk because it's people working at their desks. And if there is a potential risk, then a simple first aid kit may suffice in satisfying your obligations. Accidents. A serious accident or injury at work must be reported to the employer wherever it occurs. So you therefore need to establish proper procedures to allow home workers to report their accidents. Now looking at special equipment. There is no legal obligation on you to provide the equipment necessary for home working, but obviously with many of us, if you don't provide it, then they can't work from home. You need to look at each individual home worker to ensure that you comply with any duties that you have towards that individual. For example, if the home worker has a disability, the provision of equipment or reimbursement of expenses will be required as a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act 2010. Most employers will want the home worker to use only their equipment, because obviously you can regulate and withdraw the equipment at any time. It'll need to make sure that it is compatible with the company's systems and have the proper virus protections and security measures in place. If home working is more than minimal, it will also be sensible to provide a dedicated telephone, whether that's a mobile or other facility. Regular home workers may also need broadband, high-speed internet, or access to a printer and, as we've said before, a shredder. It'll be sensible for you to stipulate that any computer and telephone that's provided by the company is for business use only and may not be used by anyone other than the employee. I suspect most of your policies say that it can only be used for business purposes, maybe with a reasonable amount of personal use, but it probably doesn't deal with the issue of somebody else having access to the equipment, and therefore you must address this point. Computer and other equipment provided by you may also count as a taxable benefit if it's put at the disposal of the employee or their family for private use. So more generally, home workers should be warned against use of unauthorised software. Steps should also be taken to ensure that those working at home receive guidance on how to install antivirus protection and software updates in order to protect the information on the computer from accidental loss, damage, destruction, or of course, unlawful processing. And in addition, you need to keep that software and virus protections up to date. If employees are using their own equipment, then you may seek an agreement that the employer will pay the cost of maintenance, repair, and fair wear and tear of that equipment. In return, employees should undertake to maintain the equipment properly, enter into any appropriate service contracts, and replace it when necessary. If they are, of course, using their own personal computer equipment, it'll be vital that you've put in place the terms concerned other third parties using it, perhaps in the family, or having access to it because of the information that will be held on it. Planning. A home worker will not normally require planning permission, provided that there are no structural alterations to their home to facilitate home working, and any business use remains ancillary to the use of the house as a main residence. However, that's a question of degree. If there are structural changes to the house, or if the house is used for wider business purposes, then planning permission may need to be required. There would generally be no obligation on the employer to fund this unless it's expressly provided for in the contract, so it's unlikely that that would be an issue. But if you get asked by an employee if you could please fund the extension to their house because they're going to put in a lovely orangery where they're able to work, I think you can probably say no to it. Insurance. Any equipment provided by the employer will need to be covered by your insurance policy if that's possible. If this is not possible, you should require the employee to take out and maintain satisfactory insurance cover. If this involves additional cost over and above their standard policy, then you may agree that you will reimburse the costs involved. From a tax point of view, a home worker is simply an employee, so they should be taxed through the PAYE system in the normal way and in relation to expenses. Household expenses and travel costs. Now, I know this has been brought up as a question by many of my clients. So a home worker who is an employee may be entitled to claim a deduction against taxable income for certain household expenses and travel costs. That comes under the Income Tax, Employment and Pensions Act 2003, sections 336 and 337. For a household expense to be tax deductible, the expense must be incurred wholly, exclusively, and necessarily in the performance of the duties of employment. That's what section 336 says. Guidelines issued by HMRC state that the section 336 test will be met if all of the following requirements are met. Firstly, the duties carried out at home are substantive duties of employment, meaning they represent all or part of the central duties of the employee's employment. 2, those duties cannot be performed without the use of the appropriate facilities. And 3, no such appropriate facilities are available to the employee on the employer's premises, or the nature of the job requires the employee to live so far from the employer's premises that it's unreasonable to expect them to travel to those premises on a daily basis. At no time, either before or after the contract is drawn up, is the employee able to choose between working at the employer's premises or elsewhere. So if you think about the things that would normally apply, in my view, to say why it would be a no in terms of being able to claim this is a taxable benefit or make it tax deductible, is that there will be facilities available at the employer's premises for them to carry out their job, and they would be able to travel there to be able to carry out the work if it was necessary. HMRC applies these rules restrictively. So the fact that an employee does some work at home because there's no time to complete it during the working day, or because the employer's premises are too far away or inconvenient to reach, is not sufficient. Similarly, relief will not be available where an employee simply chooses to work from home some of the time, as the 3rd and 4th requirements, which I've just commented on, will not be met. If a home worker can satisfy the test, then the following deductions can be claimed: the additional cost of lighting and heating a room while being used for work, the metered cost of water used in the performance of the duties. I suspect that's probably related to making a cup of tea regularly throughout the day. The unit cost of business telephone calls and business internet connection. However, some expenditure is considered to be incurred mainly for domestic purposes in a single indivisible sum, and therefore no part is incurred wholly and exclusively for the performance of the duties. No relief is therefore available for such expenditure to include council tax or rates, rent, water rates, mortgage repayments or endowment premiums, if any exist, household insurance premiums. So the fact that an employee is entitled to a deduction for the additional expenses of working at home does not automatically mean that they're entitled to a deduction of expenses for travelling from home to another permanent workplace. The employee has to show that the location of their home is an objective requirement of the job rather than a personal choice. Payments by employers to reimburse employees for reasonable additional household expenses incurred while working at home have been exempt since the 6th of April 2003 under the ITEPA. The exemption only applies where the employee works at home regularly by agreement with the employer instead of working on the employer's premises. It does not apply if the employee simply takes work home from time to time. The payments are intended to meet reasonable additional household expenses, and as a general guidance, HMRC will approve a payment of £6 a week to an employee working at home without supporting evidence of the cost. A greater amount may be granted by HMRC if there is evidence to justify that greater cost. Tax and computer equipment. If a computer is provided to an employee to use at home in the course of their employment, no income tax charge will arise provided any private use is insignificant. HMRC confirms that where a computer is provided by an employer because it's necessary for an employee to be able to carry out the duties of the employment either at home or whilst travelling or at work, it is highly unlikely that any private use made of that equipment will be significant when compared with the business need for providing the computer in the first place. In these circumstances, Section 316 will apply and no tax charge will arise. So to ensure that a tax charge does not arise, the parties may wish to enter into an agreement under which the use of the computer equipment for non-business purposes is prohibited or kept to a level which is insignificant. So again, that's looking at your IT and communications policies. However, where the computer equipment is made available to the employee or other members of their household for private use, a tax charge may arise on the annual value of the benefit, usually 20% of the equipment's market value. Tax relief may be available where the computer is used part for business and part for non-business, and similarly a tax charge will arise if the computer is gifted to an employee. Just to make you aware, until the end of the 2020-2021 tax year, there's a temporary exemption from income tax and NICs for expenses reimbursed by an employer to an employee, where the expenses are incurred on the purchase of equipment obtained for the sole purpose of enabling the employee to work from home due to COVID-19. Just a few frequently asked questions. What types of work lend themselves to home working? Basically any work which can be done from home without adversely affecting any service to clients or customers. Should only involve limited administrative support and be capable of being monitored remotely. Who can be a home worker? Anybody can be a home worker, but they need to be self-motivated, self-reliant, disciplined and able to complete work to scheduled deadlines. They also must be able to cope with the extra pressures of working from home. What questions can employers ask? You will need to be satisfied that the worker has a suitable place to work at home and is able to ensure that domestic and family commitments don't prevent them from working. I would steer clear of asking any questions about childcare, especially if you're in a lockdown situation where the schools may have been shut down again, although that's not looking likely. Can a worker be made to work at home? If working from home is a clear requirement of the contract, then yes. If the employer wishes to impose home working at a later date, then that constitutes a change to the contract and will need to be agreed by the employee by consent. Do you have to agree to home working? So what if somebody insists on it? Do you have to permit it? Whilst employees don't have the right to work at home, an employer must consider whether the request is reasonable, for example, where a flexible working request has been made under the appropriate legislation, or where there may be a claim for sex or disability discrimination that arises because a request has been made and has been refused by the company. Now, I'm very aware that that was a lot of information that I've gone through, so please feel free to ask any questions that you want.
Thanks, Sally. There's already been a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them out or do you want to read them?
Should I deal with that one that we had in before?
Yeah.
So the question that we had in before, if I read it out, we've recently gone totally home working. Everyone has been given a Dse assessment. So this is great. So this is them carrying out the health and safety assessment that needs to be carried out for a home worker. And they need to complete it and they've been issued with a home working policy. It was decided that we wouldn't do home office assessments as this was felt to be too intrusive. That's where I talked about reserving the right to access the home to do an assessment. But we've asked employees to submit a photo or plan of their working space. Subsequently, we've issued revised contracts of employment. There are a few employees who filled in the assessment but are not willing to send in a photo or plan. Do we let this go or do we insist? Where do we stand from a legal point of view? My advice on that is that you must insist on a picture, because either if you're not going to be entitled to be able to access to assess whether or not they're working safely, then you must be able to assess it from relevant pictures being provided to you. So I think there has to be a requirement, and for them to be informed that in order for them to continue to work from home, they've got to provide you with the necessary information so that you can comply with your health and safety obligations and do a proper risk assessment. That was that one.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that's done. I don't know who asked that, but hopefully whoever that was, that answered your question.
Elaine, is that you waving? Do you want to come off mute?
Can I just say that we can't insist that somebody, we've gone the other way round. We've made everybody home workers, and everybody's been very happy with that. So the fact that we can't insist, we can't make them go back to an office because we haven't got one, if you see what I mean. So
okay, so we haven't got the threat of, okay, we won't allow you to do any more home working because that's been removed. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Well, so in that situation, I think you need to point out to the employees that they've got an implied duty to comply with health and safety. And no doubt in your contract of employment, you've also got an express clause that says you've got to comply with the company's policies on health and safety. Well, this is part of complying with those obligations. So then it either becomes, I don't really want to say it, but it either becomes a disciplinary issue, or, you know, you end up issuing something to the employees, which is not what I would advise that you do, that says, well, you know, we're not responsible for any accidents or any injury that you suffer as a result of not allowing us to carry out the assessment. I'd leave that as a last-ditch attempt to deal with the matter. But I think if you say you're obliged by your contract and by law to comply with our health and safety policies, and therefore you are obliged to do it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks both. Just read out one of the questions then in the chat area. what happens if you and your partner are both working from home and you work for separate companies? Is this classed as double claiming?
I don't believe so, because in my view, ultimately the equipment that's being provided is being provided by a different company, and you have different obligations. So I would suspect that in that situation, if you're being provided with that benefit and it relates to that company, then you can make a claim just as much as the partner can in relation to the benefit that's being provided, or the tax benefits, or the tax deduction that would apply from the equipment, obviously the work that you're carrying out. The answer is, I think you both claim.
Okay, thank you. Laura, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
My mind's gone blank now. What was my question? Oh yeah, that was it. It was just, do you have to? So our guys are working from home part time, but they can come in the office if they want. And there's no stipulation on how long they have to be at home or in the office. It's kind of up to them. So we were going to just have a home working policy to cover what they should be thinking about when they're at home, you know, the data protection and you know, safe desk setup and all that sort of stuff. So can we do that and not have to change their employment contracts?
But the problem you've got at the moment is that if they are doing a mixture of being at home and in the workplace, that's already a change from their contract of employment, because their contract says that their workplace is presumably Hewitt's office.
Yeah.
So my overall view on this is that even if it's an addendum, but it's a temporary addendum, from a legal point of view, you'd be better to do it and put it in writing as an addendum to their contract to set out the terms that will apply. Now, there's a real difference to saying, whilst you're working at home, we expect that you would make sure that you dedicate your hours of work to the, you know, doing your work, etc., etc. That's different to what obligations arise in relation to place of work, hours of work, when they're taking breaks, and all of the things that I ran through, which I think does need to be addressed in an addendum, even if you don't issue a new contract.
Okay.
I think it needs a policy and a contract or addendum change to deal with those points.
Okay, thank you.
Did I see somebody else flash up with a comment then?
Yeah, Elaine said surely this would be covered by a working from home policy rather than a home working policy.
Yeah, absolutely. You can deal with it in there. But remember, whatever you put in a policy is different to the contractual terms. So I'm not sure how you've all got your contracts and policies structured, but what tends to happen is the really important clauses go into the contract, the ones that you want to be able to enforce, but then all of your policies tend to be non-binding, they're non-contractual. So you need to make sure that you've got the right mix of an addendum that deals with the contractual requirements and then the other obligations that can be dealt with under, as you've said, a home working policy. Does that help?
Okay. Has anyone else got any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, you're more than welcome to.
Hello, me again. Is there anywhere you can sort of download like a home working template policy or something? Would that be ACAS or something like that?
I reckon I could probably give everybody that's done the webinar a freebie.
Oh, you beauty. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll
Would that help everybody? Would that help everybody? Yeah.
Yes, lots of nods and thumbs up. Should we sort that out offline?
I'll email it through to you, Liv, and then you can send it out to the delegates.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you, Sally. Okay. Any final questions then? Last chance. No. Okay. A huge thank you then to Sally and a virtual round of applause.